Hi, welcome to the Working Constitution Part 1. We're going to look through 4 different videos at what we call the 4 cornerstones of the Constitution or the 4 guiding principles. If you remember in class, we talked about how the Articles of Confederation proved that they had a government that was too weak. They had given too much power to the states. But they were really concerned also that before the American Revolution, Britain's power had become too powerful. So the framers of the Constitution really struggled with this question. How do we create a strong central government, but at the same time limit the government's power and protect the people's rights? And that's kind of the focus. How do we protect the people? So they came up with 4 things: federalism, separation of powers, constitutional flexibility, and equal rights. That these 4 guiding principles that we will often call the cornerstones of the Constitution. And we're going to look at how the people really give the government the power to carry out things by putting these limits in place. And this video is going to focus on that first cornerstone, federalism. Federalism can be defined as the division of government authority between the federal and state governments. So a lot of times when students see that division part, they go to separation of powers. They think of those 3 branches. But the second part of this definition is really important, between federal and state governments. So in other words, there are certain things the federal government can do, but underneath the federal government, there's also the state and working with the state's local governments. There's certain things they can do, and we want to take a look at that. So if we were to take federal and state power and compare them a little bit through our little Venn diagram, we can get some good examples here. And you should know at least some of these examples. And as we go through the year, we're going to be looking for federalism in every historic event from this point forward. So I want to start with the federal government's powers. These are powers delegated to the federal government. You might hear that term, delegated powers. Just think that they've been handed over to the federal government. And so there are a number of things, like only the federal government can print and coin money. Only the federal government can regulate and control interstate trade, meaning trade between the states. Only the federal government can create up our postal service and our post offices. Federal government can declare war. The federal government maintains our armed forces. That's why we have a national army, not kind of armies for each state and so on. So these are kind of important roles that the government has. The federal government has a federal court system as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the 3 branches later in another video. And the federal government is able to do this because it has the right to make laws that are necessary and proper. That's what it says in Clause 18 of Article 1 of the Constitution, meaning it makes laws that kind of match the times. That's called the elastic clause. We'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. There's also certain things spelled out in the Constitution that are what we call denied powers, meaning the federal government cannot do these things, like grant titles of nobility. That was a big thing. They didn't want to be like England again. Can't tax exports. Deny people basic human rights. And we're going to talk about human rights a lot. That's one of our other cornerstones this year. So there's these things that the federal government is not allowed to do. The Constitution also, though, reserves powers to the states and by default to the local governments in those states. Things such as controlling education. That's why in New York State we have Regents exams, but students in other states may not take a state exam like New York. Intrastate commerce, meaning trade between New York. So the state of New York can regulate and have a say over trade between Rochester and Buffalo, or between Syracuse and New York City. But trade from New York City to New Jersey or to Florida would come under the federal government as interstate commerce. They deal with crimes within the state, and that's why we have state police to help with that and a state court system. Traffic laws, so there's a state speed limit. Marriage and divorce laws. And by the way, with traffic laws and marriage, I would also point out it's states that control licensing. That's why in New York State, you get a New York State driver's license. That's why you can get your permit at 16 in New York, but in other states such as North Carolina, you can get it at about 15. They control drinking laws, and we'll talk later in the year that all the states have the same drinking age, but they do have different rules, and that comes at the state level. And a lot of this is really spelled out because of what's called the 10th Amendment. We're going to look at the Bill of Rights late in a later lesson. And the 10th Amendment basically says that powers not delegated or to the federal government can be reserved to the states, and we'll look at that. So the 10th Amendment kind of gives the power for these reserved powers. But there's also powers specifically denied to the states, some of which are those delegated powers. States cannot make their own money. They cannot sign treaties with other nations. Only the federal government can do that. They cannot declare war. They cannot tax imports or exports. And so taxing imports comes under the federal government. They can't punish citizens without what we call due process of law. Those are those rules when you see on TV someone getting read their rights to remain silent, that an attorney can be provided for them. Those are due process rights. We'll be looking at those later as well. Denying people basically any kinds of rights. The states cannot do that. So there's certain denied powers as well. Then there are certain things that both the federal government and the states can do. They're called concurrent powers. They happen at the same time. They can enforce all laws. And so states may help with some federal laws, may not sometimes. They can raise taxes. They build roads. We have an interstate system. Interstate 90 goes through New York. But we also have state roads like State Route 5 that goes through our town, Canandaigua. And then there's a federal road, Route 20, US 20, that goes through as well. And they establish and maintain court systems. So we have a federal court system, state court system, county and city court system as well. On top of all of this, there's certain federal obligations to the states, meaning these are things the states have to have done for them by the federal government. The federal government has to allow for a system to admit new states. And we looked at that a bit with the Northwest Ordinance when we studied the Articles of Confederation. They can assure what we call Republican government, meaning representative government. And that word Republican, again, is one I would really note, that it means a representative form of government. They have to protect the states. That's part of what having a standing army and navy is all about. So the next question then is, when you look at all of those things, in fact, I'm going to go back to that for a second, there could be conflicts. In other words, a state could make a law that conflicts with a federal law. And so the question becomes, what happens when state and federal laws come into conflict? And this question wasn't really answered at first when they created the Constitution, but it really came into play later. And we're going to look at that in our history, that really the federal law is supreme. It outranks state or local laws. It's not always pretty, but we'll be looking at examples of where it gets kind of messy and how they work it out throughout our history. So next time we're going to look at separation of powers a little bit, but I want you to really think about that idea of federalism and the idea that different levels of government have different things they can do. It was a way to make sure the states had some power so they're not abused by the federal government, but that the federal government had enough power to get some things done. So think about those as we move forward.